Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight, wherever you are in the world, whether resting in your room, drifting in a quiet place, or settling down after a long day, we'll journey together into the life of Saladin, the Sultan who shaped an age. If you truly enjoy these calm history stories, I would love if you pressed the like button and subscribed. But only if you truly enjoy them. It would mean the world to me. Let us drift back now. Close your eyes, if you will, and imagine with me a world where silk caravans moved like slow rivers across endless deserts, where scribes bent over parchments by candlelight, copying the wisdom of ages, and where the clash of cultures created something beautiful and strange and new. In the year 1137 of the Christian calendar, the year 532 in the Islamic tradition, the Tigris River flowed as it always had through the ancient city of Tikrit, carrying the memories of empires in its muddy waters. This was a place where Assyrian kings had once ruled, where Roman legions had marched, where the first caliphs had planted the seeds of a new civilization. The city sat like a jewel on the eastern bank of the river, its walls catching the first light of dawn as fishermen cast their nets into waters that reflected the pale sky. It was here, in this crossroads between the old world and the new, between the settled lands and the wandering tribes, that a child was born who would one day be known by many names. The Christians would call him Saladin, their tongues struggling with the Arabic sounds. His own people knew him as Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Joseph, son of Job, though history would remember him as Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, the rightness of the faith. But on that quiet morning in Tikrit, he was simply a baby, crying in his mother's arms, while outside the walls the desert stretched endlessly toward horizons that shimmered with heat and possibility. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, was a man caught between worlds, as so many were in that age. A Kurd by birth, he had risen in the service of the Turkish dynasties that ruled much of the Islamic world. The Kurds were mountain people, fierce and independent, known for their skill in war and their loyalty to those who earned their trust. They had no great cities of their own, no monuments to rival Baghdad or Cairo, but they had something else, a deep understanding of the land itself, of the winds that blew across the high passes and the valleys where wildflowers bloomed in spring. Ayyub served as governor of Tikrit under the distant authority of the Seljuk Sultans, those Turkish warriors who had swept down from the steppes generations before and carved an empire from the remnants of earlier conquests. But even as baby Yusuf drew his first breaths, that empire was beginning to crack along its vast edges. The great Seljuk Sultan Sanjar, ruler of the East, was growing old, and his grip on the distant provinces was loosening like sand falling through fingers. The world into which Saladin was born was one of extraordinary complexity and beauty, where the intellectual achievements of the Islamic Golden Age were beginning to flower in ways that would astonish future generations. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom continued its work of the translation and discovery, turning Greek philosophy and Indian mathematics into Arabic texts that would eventually find their way to the libraries of Europe. In Cairo, the Fatimid caliphs maintained their mysterious court, claiming descent from the Prophet's daughter and practicing a form of Islam that seemed exotic even to other Muslims. In Damascus, the Atabeg Zengi was beginning to forge the beginnings of what would become a great counter-crusade, though few could see it at the time. But perhaps most important of all, in the hospitals and schools, the libraries and observatories of the Islamic world, scholars were engaged in a quiet revolution that would change the course of human knowledge. The physician Ibn Sina, known to the West as Avicenna, had already written his great medical texts. The philosopher Al-Ghazali had completed his synthesis of Islamic theology and Aristotelian logic. The mathematician Al-Kindi had laid the foundations of algebra, and astronomers in Cordoba and Samarkand were mapping the movements of stars with an accuracy that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. This was the civilization into which Saladin was born, a world where a Kurdish chieftain's son could rise to rule from the shores of the Atlantic to the banks of the Euphrates, where a boy from a small city in Iraq could become the defender of Jerusalem and the greatest military genius of his age. It was a world where dreams could become reality, but only for those with the courage to pursue them across deserts that could kill the unprepared, and through courts where a wrong word could mean exile or death. The young Yusuf spent his earliest years in Tikrit, playing in the dusty streets that sloped down toward the river, listening to the merchants' tales from the bazaar, watching the boats that carried goods and people up and down the great waterway that connected his small world to places whose names he had not yet learned to pronounce. His mother told him stories of the great heroes of Islam, of Ali and his sword Dhul Fiqar, of Umar ibn al-Khattab and his conquests, of the Prophet himself and his night journey to Jerusalem. These tales settled into the boy's imagination like seeds in fertile ground, waiting for the right season to bloom. When Yusuf was perhaps 7 years old, still young enough to ride on his father's shoulders, but old enough to understand that the world extended beyond the walls of Tikrit, an event occurred that would change the course of his family's fortunes, and ultimately the history of the entire Middle East. A dispute arose between his father Ayub and his uncle Shirkuh on one side, and a local commander on the other. The details of the quarrel have been lost to time. Perhaps it was over taxation, or the division of military spoils, or simply a matter of honor that could not be overlooked without loss of face. What matters is that the dispute escalated beyond what anyone had intended, and in the end, the local commander lay dead. In the intricate code of honor that governed such matters, this was not necessarily a crime, but it was certainly a complication. Ayub and Shirkuh found themselves in a position where remaining in Tikrit would invite retribution from the dead man's kinsmen and allies. They had to leave, and quickly, taking their families and their followers with them. So, it was that young Yusuf experienced his first great journey, riding in a caravan that wound its way northwest across the Mesopotamian plain toward the ancient city of Mosul. He would remember later the way the landscape changed as they traveled, the date palms giving way to rolling hills, the irrigation canals that brought life to the desert margins, the ruined tells that marked the sites of cities whose names had been forgotten even then. He would remember the taste of dust on his tongue, and the way his mother sang softly to keep him calm during the long, hot days in the saddle. Mosul was a revelation to the boy who had never seen anything larger than Tikrit. Here was a real city, with walls that seemed to stretch forever, with markets where you could buy silk from China and ivory from Africa, spices from India and furs from the far north. The great mosque rose like a mountain at the city's heart, its minaret visible from miles away, calling the faithful to prayer 5 times each day with a voice that seemed to come from heaven itself. More important for the family's future, Mosul was the seat of Imad ad-Din Zengi, the most formidable of the Muslim commanders who were beginning to organize resistance to the Crusader states. Zengi was a man who understood that the key to defeating the Frankish kingdoms lay not in dramatic gestures or individual heroics, but in the patient work of building alliances, training armies, and above all, uniting the fractured Muslim world under a single banner. Ayub and Shirkuh entered Zengi's service, bringing with them their Kurdish followers and their knowledge of warfare in the desert borderlands. For young Yusuf, this meant a new life in a great man's court, where he could observe the intricate dance of politics and diplomacy that held the Islamic world together. He learned to read not just Arabic script, but the subtle signs of power, who stood where during audiences, who spoke first in council, whose advice was sought on military matters, and whose was politely ignored. Zengi himself was a figure from legend, tall and hawk-nosed, with eyes that seemed to see through pretense to the truth beneath. He had already recaptured the Crusader city of Edessa, the first major Muslim victory over the Frankish kingdoms, and his reputation for both military genius and ruthless determination was spreading throughout the Islamic world. But he was also a man who understood the importance of learning, and his court attracted scholars and poets, physicians and astronomers, creating an atmosphere where a bright young boy like Yusuf could absorb knowledge from a dozen different sources. The boy learned Arabic poetry and Persian verse, the principles of Islamic law, and the subtleties of Quranic interpretation. He studied mathematics and astronomy, geography and history. Most important of all, he learned the arts of war, not just how to wield a sword or shoot a bow, though he became skilled at both, but how to read terrain, how to judge the morale of troops, how to coordinate the movements of cavalry and infantry in ways that could turn the tide of battle. Under Zengi's patronage, the family prospered. Ayub proved himself a capable administrator and military commander, while Shirkuh's reputation as a warrior grew with each successful campaign. Young Yusuf absorbed it all like a sponge, watching and learning, beginning to understand that power in the Islamic world came not from birth alone, but from a combination of military skill, political acumen, religious devotion, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to inspire loyalty in others. When Yusuf was 11 years old, Zengi was assassinated by one of his own servants, apparently in revenge for some perceived slight. The news sent shockwaves throughout the Muslim world, but it also created opportunities for those skilled enough to seize them. Zengi's son, Nur ad-Din, inherited his father's territories and his mission, but he would need to prove himself worthy of both. For families like the Ayyubids, this meant a chance to rise even higher in service to a new master who would need all the help he could get. Nur ad-Din was everything his father had been, and more. A warrior saint who combined military genius with genuine religious devotion. a man who could inspire his followers to extraordinary sacrifices in service of what they saw as a holy cause. Under his patronage, young Yusuf's education continued, but now it took on a new dimension. He was not just learning to be a commander or an administrator, but to be a leader in the great jihad that would, God willing, drive the Crusaders from Muslim lands and restore the unity of the Islamic world. The move to Damascus, when it came, felt like stepping into the pages of the 1001 Nights. The city that had been the capital of the Umayyad caliphs, the place where the Islamic Empire had first taken shape, was still one of the wonders of the world. The great mosque, built on the site of a Roman temple, seemed to float in a sea of marble columns and golden mosaics. The covered souks stretched for miles, filled with merchants selling everything the world had to offer. The palaces and gardens of the old city whispered of bygone glories, while the new constructions commissioned by Nur ad-Din spoke of a determination to build something even greater. For Yusuf, now approaching his 15th year, Damascus represented both opportunity and challenge. He was old enough now to begin taking on real responsibilities, to prove himself worthy of his family's rising fortunes. But he was also entering a world of extraordinary complexity, where a single mistake could undo years of careful advancement, where loyalty had to be balanced against ambition, and where the arts of peace were as important as the skills of war. He studied in the madrasas that Nur ad-Din was establishing throughout his territories, great schools where the best minds of the Islamic world taught law and theology, philosophy and medicine. He learned to debate the fine points of Islamic jurisprudence, to recite the Quran with perfect pronunciation, to write poetry that could move listeners to tears or laughter. But he also learned practical skills, how to manage the irrigation systems that brought life to the desert, how to negotiate with Bedouin tribes whose friendship could make the difference between victory and defeat, how to judge the quality of horses and weapons and the men who would use them. Most importantly, he learned to watch Nur ad-Din himself, studying the way this remarkable man combined the roles of warrior and saint, administrator and inspirational leader. Nur ad-Din was someone who could lead a cavalry charge at dawn and spend the evening in prayer and contemplation, who could negotiate the surrender of a Crusader fortress and then personally tend to the wounded on both sides. He was building not just an army, but a movement, not just conquering territory, but creating the foundations for a new kind of Islamic state based on justice and religious devotion. The young Yusuf absorbed these lessons eagerly, but he also began to develop his own ideas about leadership and statecraft. He was naturally thoughtful, more inclined to consider all sides of a question before acting, more interested in finding solutions that could satisfy multiple parties than in imposing his will through force alone. These qualities would serve him well in the complex years ahead, but they also marked him as different from the typical military commander of his age. As he entered his 20s, Yusuf began to take on more significant responsibilities. He accompanied his uncle Shirkuh on diplomatic missions, learning the delicate art of negotiation that would prove as important as military skill in the campaigns to come. He helped administer the territories that Nur ad-Din was conquering and consolidating, gaining first-hand experience in the challenges of governing diverse populations who spoke different languages and followed different customs. But perhaps most importantly, he began to develop his own network of relationships with scholars and merchants, tribal chiefs and urban notables, fellow officers and common soldiers. He had inherited his father's Kurdish pragmatism and his uncle's military instincts, but he was also developing something uniquely his own, a vision of what the Islamic world could become if it could overcome its divisions and work together toward common goals. The call that would change everything came in the form of a message from Egypt, carried by a dust-covered messenger who had ridden hard across the Sinai desert with news that would reshape the political map of the Middle East. The Fatimid Caliphate, that Shia dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries, was dying from within. Palace coups and counter-coups had left the government paralyzed, while the young caliph remained a virtual prisoner in his own palace. 2 rival viziers were fighting for control, and both were seeking outside help. One of these viziers, Shawar, had fled to Damascus and was now pleading with Nur ad-Din for military assistance to restore him to power. In return, he promised enormous tribute and, more importantly, the opening of Egypt's vast wealth to help fund the continuing war against the Crusader states. For Nur ad-Din, this represented exactly the kind of opportunity he had been waiting for, a chance to unite Syria and Egypt under a single banner, creating a power strong enough to challenge not just the Frankish kingdoms, but potentially the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad itself. The decision to intervene in Egypt wasn't made lightly. The country was protected by the desert and the sea, making invasion difficult and retreat even more so. The Fatimid army, though weakened by political divisions, was still formidable, and the common people's loyalty was uncertain. Most importantly, any army sent to Egypt would be operating hundreds of miles from its base of support, dependent on supply lines that could easily be cut and surrounded by potential enemies on all sides. But Nur ad-Din was a man who understood that great rewards required great risks, and he had in Shirkuh exactly the kind of commander who could succeed where others might fail. Shirkuh was a warrior's warrior, beloved by his men for his courage and his willingness to share their hardships, respected by his enemies for his tactical brilliance and his honor in victory. If anyone could conquer Egypt for the cause of Sunni Islam, it was this Kurdish mountain fighter who had learned his trade in the harsh school of frontier warfare. The decision to include young Yusuf in the expedition was more controversial. At 26, he was still relatively inexperienced in independent command, and Egypt would offer no opportunities for the gradual learning that had marked his career thus far. But Shirkuh insisted on bringing his nephew, perhaps recognizing qualities in the young man that others had not yet seen, perhaps simply wanting someone he could trust absolutely in what promised to be a campaign where loyalty would mean the difference between triumph and disaster. The army that assembled for the march to Egypt was a reflection of the diverse coalition that Nur ad-Din had built over the years. The corps consisted of Turkish Mamluks, slave soldiers who had been trained from childhood in the arts of war and who formed the most disciplined and effective heavy cavalry in the world. Around them gathered Kurdish tribal contingents like Shirkuh's own followers, tough mountain fighters who could endure any hardship and whose loyalty to their chiefs was absolute. Arab Bedouins provided scouts and light cavalry. Their knowledge of desert routes and their ability to live off the land, making them invaluable for a long-distance campaign. Syrian infantry, drawn from the settled population, brought skills in siegecraft and engineering that would be essential if fortified cities had to be taken. The march to Egypt began in the spring of 1164, when the desert was still cool enough for rapid movement, and the water sources along the route were reliable. For young Yusuf, this was his first experience of leading men in a campaign where failure would mean not just defeat, but quite possibly death in the waterless expanses of Sinai. He learned to manage the complex logistics of moving an army across hostile territory, to coordinate the movements of different types of troops, to maintain morale during the long days when the only companions were heat and dust, and the constant awareness that enemies might appear at any moment on the horizon. The invasion of Egypt unfolded like a carefully planned symphony of movement and maneuver, with each phase building on the success of the previous one. Shirkuh's army crossed the desert with the speed and precision of a striking hawk, appearing before the Fatimid forces could organize an effective defense. The enemy army, caught off balance and demoralized by months of political chaos, offered only scattered resistance before retreating toward the safety of the fortified cities along the Nile. For Yusuf, these first battles were a revelation of what warfare could be when conducted by masters of the art. He watched his uncle deploy their forces with the precision of a chess player, using the mobility of their cavalry to strike where the enemy was weakest, while avoiding costly frontal assaults against prepared positions. He learned to read the flow of battle, to recognize the moment when an enemy line was beginning to waver, to coordinate attacks that could turn tactical advantages into strategic victories. The entry into Cairo was a moment that would remain burned in Yusuf's memory for the rest of his life. The city that had been built by the Fatimids as their capital was unlike anything he had ever seen, a place where Islamic architecture had reached heights of sophistication and beauty that seemed to transcend the merely human. The great mosque of Al-Azhar, the heart of Shia learning, rose in a forest of minarets and domes that caught the light like jewels. The palaces of the caliphs stretched along the Nile in gardens that seemed like earthly versions of paradise, filled with fountains and pools that reflected the sky like mirrors. But beneath this surface beauty, Yusuf could see the signs of a civilization in decay. The streets that should have bustled with commerce were half empty, the shops closed, or offering goods of poor quality at inflated prices. The common people looked undernourished and fearful, while the elite who remained in the city watched the new arrivals with the calculation of those who had learned to adapt quickly to changing political winds. This was a rich land made poor by misgovernment, a great city slowly dying from the diseases of division and corruption. Shirkuh moved quickly to consolidate his position, but he also recognized that holding Egypt would require more than military force. He needed to win the loyalty of the Egyptian people, or at least their acquiescence, and this would require demonstrating that the new regime could provide the security and prosperity that the Fatimids had failed to deliver. Most importantly, he needed to neutralize the various factions within the Egyptian government and military before they could unite against the Syrian occupation. It was in this context that young Yusuf began to show the political skills that would define his later career. While his uncle focused on military matters, Yusuf took on the delicate task of negotiating with the various Egyptian officials and tribal leaders whose cooperation would be essential for long-term success. He discovered that he had a natural talent for this work, an ability to understand what different people wanted and to find ways of satisfying those desires without compromising his own objectives. The Egyptian campaign was also Yusuf's introduction to the complexities of governing a population that was not just ethnically and linguistically diverse, but also divided by religious differences that went to the heart of Islamic identity. The Fatimid caliphs were Ismaili Shias, members of a branch of Islam that most Sunni Muslims considered heretical. Their rule had been maintained for 2 centuries through a combination of military force, administrative efficiency, and religious tolerance, but it had never won the wholehearted acceptance of the Egyptian population, most of whom remained Sunni in their personal beliefs, even while accepting Shia political authority. Shirkuh's army represented Sunni Islam in its most militant form, committed not just to political conquest, but to religious reformation. Yet the realities of governing Egypt required a more nuanced approach than simple sectarian enthusiasm could provide. The country's prosperity depended on trade relationships with Christian merchants from Italy and Byzantium, Jewish financiers who had served the Fatimid court for generations, and Coptic Christians who formed a substantial minority of the population and dominated certain crafts and professions. Any attempt to impose religious orthodoxy too rapidly would risk destroying the very wealth that made Egypt worth conquering in the first place. Yusuf found himself at the center of these complex negotiations, working to find compromises that could satisfy his uncle's religious principles while maintaining the practical arrangements that kept the country functioning. He learned to speak with Christian merchants in their own languages, to understand the concerns of Jewish bankers who feared that political change might mean persecution, to reassure Coptic artisans that their skills would continue to be valued under the new regime. These experiences taught him lessons about religious tolerance and political pragmatism that would prove invaluable in his later career. But the Egyptian campaign also provided Yusuf with his first direct experience of the Crusader enemy. The Frankish kingdom of Jerusalem, alarmed by the prospect of Muslim Egypt falling under the control of Nur ad-Din, had formed an alliance with the displaced Vizier Dergham and was preparing to intervene militarily to prevent Syrian consolidation of the country. This meant that Shirkuh's army might soon find itself fighting not just the remnants of Fatimid resistance, but the disciplined knights and infantry of the most formidable military force in the eastern Mediterranean. The confrontation came sooner than anyone expected, as King Amalric of Jerusalem led a substantial army across the Sinai to support Dergham's attempt to regain power. For the first time in his life, Yusuf found himself facing the heavy cavalry of the military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, whose prowess had become legendary throughout the Islamic world. These were men who had dedicated their lives to war against the Muslims, warrior monks whose combination of religious devotion and military skill made them perhaps the most dangerous opponents any Muslim commander could face. The battle that followed was unlike anything in Yusuf's previous experience. The Frankish knights, encased in mail and mounted on massive destriers, charged with a fury that seemed almost superhuman, their lances shattering the first ranks of the Muslim army like a hammer striking glass. For moments that seemed like hours, the outcome hung in balance, as disciplined formations dissolved into swirling melees where individual courage and skill mattered more than grand strategy or tactical planning. But Shirkuh was not called the mountain lion for nothing, and he had prepared for exactly this kind of encounter. As the Frankish cavalry spent itself in the initial charge, the Syrian archers and Turkish horse archers began their deadly work, sending flight after flight of arrows into the massed enemy ranks. The Muslim cavalry, lighter and more mobile than their opponents, began to swirl around the flanks of the Christian army, cutting off retreat routes and creating the kind of fluid, fast-moving battle in which Islamic military doctrine excelled. Yusuf commanded the left wing of the Muslim army during this battle, his first experience of independent battlefield command against a major enemy. He learned the terrible responsibility of leadership in combat, the weight of knowing that hundreds of men's lives depended on his decisions, the need to remain calm and decisive even when the outcome seemed uncertain and disaster appeared to be only moments away. He learned to trust his instincts and his training, to see opportunities in apparent setbacks, to coordinate the movements of cavalry and infantry in the deadly dance of medieval warfare. The victory, when it came, was complete, but not decisive. The Crusader army was forced to retreat back to Palestine, leaving Egypt in Syrian hands, but the threat of future intervention remained. More importantly, Yusuf had gained his first real insight into the strengths and weaknesses of the Frankish military machine. The knights were individually superb warriors, their equipment was excellent, and their discipline was remarkable. But they were also rigid in their tactics, slow to adapt to changing circumstances, and dependent on supply lines that could be disrupted by an enemy who understood how to use the desert as a weapon. The consolidation of Syrian control over Egypt took several years and required additional campaigns, as the various factions within the country refused to accept defeat and continued to seek outside help. Each of these conflicts provided Yusuf with new lessons in the arts of war and peace, teaching him to understand not just how to win battles, but how to turn military victories into lasting political achievements. He learned the importance of treating defeated enemies with honor, of keeping promises made in the heat of negotiations, of building the kind of reputation for fair dealing that could make future conquests easier. More importantly, the Egyptian campaigns introduced Yusuf to the extraordinary cultural and intellectual wealth of the Fatimid court. Despite their political failures, the Ismaili caliphs had been great patrons of learning, and their libraries in Cairo contained treasures that could be found nowhere else in the world. Here were manuscripts of Greek philosophy that had been lost to the West, translations of Indian mathematics and Persian poetry, original works by Islamic scholars whose names were revered from Spain to Central Asia. Yusuf became a regular visitor to these libraries, spending hours in conversation with the scholars who had served the Fatimid court and who now found themselves adapting to new masters. He learned about the mystical traditions of Sufism, the rational philosophy of the Mutazilites, the complex legal theories that had been developed to govern a diverse and sprawling empire. These intellectual encounters broadened his understanding of Islam itself, teaching him to see his faith not as a set of rigid doctrines, but as a living tradition capable of growth and adaptation. The death of Shirkuh in 1169 created a crisis that would determine the future course of Yusuf's life and, ultimately, the history of the Middle East. The mountain lion had died suddenly, possibly of natural causes, possibly of poison administered by one of the many enemies who feared his growing power. With his death, the Syrian position in Egypt became precarious, as the various factions that had been held in check by his personal authority began to maneuver for advantage. Nur ad-Din faced a difficult choice. He needed a new commander for Egypt, someone who could maintain Syrian control while managing the complex politics of the Fatimid court. The obvious candidates were experienced military leaders from his inner circle, men whose loyalty had been tested in years of campaigning and whose abilities were well known. But each of these choices carried risks. Appointing too strong a leader might create a rival, while choosing someone too weak might result in the loss of Egypt altogether. In the end, Nur ad-Din made a decision that surprised many of his advisors. He appointed Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the young nephew of the deceased commander, to serve as the new vizier of Egypt. At 31, Yusuf was younger than most of the officers under his command, and his experience of independent leadership was limited. But he had several advantages that his rivals lacked. His Kurdish background gave him the loyalty of Shirkuh's former troops. His years in Egypt had provided him with an understanding of local conditions, and perhaps most importantly, his youth and apparent lack of personal ambition made him seem like a safe choice to his master in Damascus. The appointment of Yusuf as vizier marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one in which he would have to learn to balance the competing demands of loyalty to Nur ad-Din, responsibility for the welfare of Egypt, and his own gradually expanding vision of what the Islamic world might become. He was no longer simply a military commander following orders, but a ruler in his own right, responsible for the lives and fortunes of millions of people who looked to him for security, justice, and prosperity. The early months of Yusuf's rule in Egypt were a constant test of his diplomatic and administrative skills. The young Caliph al-Adid, though nominally the head of state, was essentially powerless, a prisoner in his own palace who could be used as a source of legitimacy, but who possessed no real authority. The various factions within the Egyptian government and military had to be carefully managed, their rivalries contained without destroying their usefulness, their ambitions satisfied without compromising Syrian control. Most challenging of all was the need to maintain the delicate balance between Sunni and Shia Islam that made continued rule possible. Yusuf's own religious convictions were firmly Sunni, and he was ultimately responsible to Nur ad-Din, who saw the conversion of Egypt as one of his primary religious obligations. But any attempt to impose Sunni orthodoxy too rapidly would risk alienating the substantial portion of the Egyptian elite who remained committed to Ismaili beliefs and practices. Yusuf's solution to this dilemma revealed the political sophistication that would characterize his entire career. Rather than forcing immediate change, he began a gradual process of reform that slowly shifted the religious balance of the country without creating the kind of dramatic confrontation that could have led to civil war. Sunni scholars were invited to teach in the great mosque of Al-Azhar, but Ismaili professors were not immediately dismissed. New madrasas were established to promote orthodox Islamic education, but existing Shia institutions were allowed to continue functioning. Friday prayers began to be said in the name of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, rather than the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo, but this change was presented as a return to Islamic unity, rather than a sectarian victory. This gradual approach required enormous patience and skill, as Yusuf had to satisfy his master's expectations while avoiding the kind of religious upheaval that could have destroyed his ability to govern effectively. He had to learn to speak different languages to different audiences, reassuring Nur ad-Din that the conversion of Egypt was proceeding according to plan, while convincing Egyptian officials that their interests would be protected under the new dispensation. The success of this policy became evident when the last Fatimid Caliph, Al-Adid, died in 1171, bringing an end to 2 centuries of Ismaili rule in Egypt. The transition to full Sunni orthodoxy occurred without the civil war that many had predicted, as Yusuf had built enough support among the Egyptian elite to make resistance seem both futile and unnecessary. The formal declaration of Egypt's return to the Abbasid Caliphate was celebrated with great ceremony, but it was a ceremony that marked the completion of a process rather than its violent beginning. With the religious question settled, at least for the moment, Yusuf could turn his attention to the broader challenges of governing Egypt and defending it against its enemies. The country's strategic position at the crossroads of Africa and Asia made it incredibly wealthy, but it also made it a target for anyone seeking to control the trade routes that connected the Indian Ocean with the Mediterranean. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem remained a constant threat, while Byzantine naval power in the eastern Mediterranean posed dangers to Egypt's sea trade. More immediately, Yusuf had to deal with the challenge of maintaining Egyptian loyalty to the broader Syrian state that Nur ad-Din was building. Egypt's wealth far exceeded that of Syria, and its population was larger and in many ways more sophisticated. The natural tendency would be for the Egyptians to resent Syrian domination and to seek independence at the first opportunity. Only by proving that Syrian rule could bring benefits that outweighed its costs could Yusuf hope to maintain the unity that Nur ad-Din sought. The solution lay in transforming Egypt from a Syrian dependency into a partner in the broader Islamic revival that was slowly gathering strength throughout the Middle East. Rather than simply extracting tribute to fund Syrian military campaigns, Yusuf began to present Egyptian involvement in the struggle against the Crusaders as a patriotic duty that could restore the country to its rightful position as the leader of the Islamic world. Egyptian wealth would be used not just to support Syrian armies, but to build Egyptian forces that could play a leading role in the liberation of Jerusalem and the other occupied territories. This shift in emphasis required changes not just in policy, but in the fundamental structure of the Egyptian state. Yusuf began to build a new kind of government, one that combined the administrative efficiency that had made the Fatimid state successful with the military dynamism that characterized Nur ad-Din's regime in Syria. He recruited new officials from the ranks of Sunni scholars and administrators, but he also retained many Fatimid bureaucrats whose expertise was too valuable to lose. He expanded the Egyptian army, but he did so by incorporating existing units rather than by destroying them and starting over. The process of military rebuilding was particularly important, as it required Yusuf to create forces that could hold their own against the best that the Crusader states could field. The Fatimid army had been formidable in its day, but years of political instability had left it demoralized and poorly equipped. Syrian reinforcements had provided the core of reliable troops, but they were too few to defend a country as large and wealthy as Egypt without substantial local support. Yusuf's solution was to create a new kind of military force that combined the best features of different traditions. Turkish Mamluks provided the heavy cavalry that was essential for battlefield success against Frankish knights. Kurdish tribal levies offered the mobility and endurance needed for desert campaigning. Egyptian infantry, trained in the traditions that had made the Fatimid army feared throughout the Mediterranean, brought expertise in siege warfare and naval combat. But perhaps most importantly, Yusuf understood that military strength alone would not be sufficient to achieve the great objectives that were slowly taking shape in his mind. The Islamic world had been divided for too long, weakened by sectarian disputes and dynastic rivalries that had made it vulnerable to external enemies. What was needed was not just better armies, but a new kind of leadership that could unite Muslims behind a common vision of renewal and restoration. This vision began to crystallize during the long, quiet evenings that Yusuf spent in his palace overlooking the Nile, when the heat of the day had given way to the gentle coolness of the Egyptian night, and the call to prayer echoed across the ancient city. He would stand on his terrace, watching the river flow past in the moonlight, carrying the memories of pharaohs and caliphs, of Alexander's conquest and Amr's invasion, of all the rises and falls that had marked this eternal crossroads of civilizations. In those contemplative moments, Yusuf began to understand that he was living through one of history's turning points, a time when the old order was passing away and something new was struggling to be born. The Crusader states, for all their military prowess, were ultimately foreign implants that could not survive indefinitely in hostile soil. The various Islamic dynasties, for all their pretensions to legitimacy, had failed to provide the kind of leadership that the Muslim world desperately needed. The time was coming when someone would have to step forward and take responsibility for reuniting the Ummah, the global community of believers, around principles that could inspire a new golden age. The death of Nur ad-Din in 1174 created exactly the kind of crisis that could either destroy everything that had been built or provide the opportunity for something even greater to emerge. The great Atabeg had died suddenly, possibly of poison, leaving behind a young son who was not yet ready to rule, and a coalition of allies and subordinates who immediately began maneuvering for position in the new dispensation. For Yusuf in Egypt, this created both opportunity and danger on a scale that would test everything he had learned about leadership and statecraft. The immediate question was whether he would remain a loyal subordinate to Nur ad-Din's son and heir, as Salih Ismail, or whether he would seize the opportunity to establish his independence and pursue his own vision of Islamic revival. Many of his advisers urged him to break with Damascus immediately, arguing that Egypt's wealth and strategic position made it capable of standing alone against any combination of enemies. Others counseled continued loyalty, pointing out that Nur ad-Din's coalition was still formidable and that premature independence might lead to a destructive war between Muslim states at a time when unity was more essential than ever. Yusuf's response to this crisis revealed the political maturity he had developed during his years as ruler of Egypt. Rather than making an immediate decision that might have to be reversed later, he chose to wait and watch, maintaining formal loyalty to Damascus while quietly building his own power base and preparing for whatever developments might emerge. He sent appropriate messages of condolence and pledges of continued allegiance, but he also began to strengthen his fortifications and expand his army in ways that would give him options regardless of how the succession crisis resolved itself. This period of uncertainty lasted for nearly 2 years, during which Yusuf demonstrated the patience and strategic thinking that would characterize his entire career. He used the time to complete the transformation of Egypt from a Syrian dependency into an independent power capable of pursuing its own objectives. He built new alliances with Bedouin tribes and urban notables, expanded trade relationships with Italian city-states and Indian ocean merchants, and strengthened the religious and educational institutions that were slowly converting Egypt into a center of Sunni orthodoxy. Most importantly, he used these years to refine his understanding of what the Islamic world needed and how he might be able to provide it. The various Muslim states were trapped in a cycle of conflict and competition that prevented them from responding effectively to external threats. What was needed was a leader who could rise above these petty rivalries and unite the Ummah around the great objectives that all Muslims shared: the liberation of Jerusalem, the defense of Islamic territory, and the restoration of justice and prosperity under divine guidance. When the final break with Damascus came, it emerged not from Yusuf's ambition, but from the inability of as-Salih's advisers to accept the reality of Egyptian independence. Syrian armies invaded Egypt in 1175, forcing Yusuf to choose between submission and resistance. He chose resistance, but he did so in a way that minimized the religious and political costs of conflict between Muslims. Rather than denouncing as-Salih as illegitimate, he presented himself as defending Egypt's autonomy within a broader Islamic commonwealth. Rather than seeking to destroy Syrian power, he aimed at establishing a new balance that could eventually lead to voluntary reunification under more favorable circumstances. The war that followed was brief but decisive, as Yusuf's reformed Egyptian army proved more than capable of defeating the forces that Damascus could bring to bear. The Syrian invasion collapsed within months, leaving as-Salih's government weakened and discredited while enhancing Yusuf's reputation throughout the Islamic world as both a skilled military commander and a leader who could unify rather than divide the community of believers. The victory over Syria marked the beginning of Yusuf's transformation from regional ruler to major figure in Islamic politics. He was no longer simply the Vizier of Egypt, maintaining power on behalf of distant masters, but an independent sultan whose decisions would affect the entire Middle East. This new status brought with it responsibilities and opportunities that would test his abilities to the limit, but it also opened the possibility of achieving the great objectives that had been taking shape in his mind for years. The first of these objectives was the unification of Egypt and Syria under a single authority capable of challenging the Crusader states effectively. The division of Muslim forces had been one of the primary reasons for Frankish success, as the various Islamic rulers had often been more concerned with fighting each other than with confronting the common enemy. Only by creating a unified command structure stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates could Muslim forces hope to match the coordination and discipline that had made the military orders so formidable. Achieving this unification required a delicate balance of military pressure and political persuasion, as Yusuf could not afford to alienate potential allies by appearing too aggressive in his pursuit of regional hegemony. His approach was to present himself not as a conqueror, but as a unifier, someone who could bring together the various Muslim factions in service of objectives that transcended narrow dynastic interests. When Syrian cities opened their gates to his armies, they were joining a movement for Islamic renewal rather than submitting to foreign conquest. The process of unification took several years and required constant attention to the complex web of relationships that connected the various centers of power in Syria. Damascus was the traditional capital, but Aleppo was equally ancient and equally proud. The Atabegs of Mosul controlled important territory along the eastern frontier, while the emirs of smaller cities had to be convinced that their local interests would be protected under the new dispensation. Each negotiation required a different approach, as Yusuf had to demonstrate both strength and flexibility, showing that he could be either a valuable ally or a dangerous enemy, depending on the choices that other rulers made. By 1176, most of Syria had been brought under Yusuf's authority, either through voluntary submission or through carefully limited military campaigns that avoided the kind of destruction that might have made future cooperation impossible. The great exception was Aleppo, whose ruler Imad ad-Din Zengi II continued to resist despite being essentially surrounded by territories loyal to the new sultan. This resistance was not merely a matter of personal pride, but reflected genuine concerns about whether Yusuf could provide the kind of leadership that Nur ad-Din had offered. Military success combined with religious devotion and administrative competence. The siege of Aleppo became a test not just of military capability, but of political legitimacy, as observers throughout the Islamic world watched to see whether Yusuf could complete the unification process without destroying the very unity he claimed to be seeking. His approach was characteristically patient and sophisticated, combining military pressure with diplomatic initiatives designed to convince the city's defenders that their long-term interests lay in negotiation rather than continued resistance. The agreement that eventually ended the siege reflected Yusuf's growing mastery of the arts of statecraft. Rather than demanding unconditional surrender, he negotiated a settlement that preserved the dignity of Aleppo's rulers while bringing the city into his growing federation of Syrian territories. Former enemies were given positions of responsibility in the new administration, local customs and privileges were respected, and the city's role as a center of Islamic learning was explicitly protected and encouraged. With the unification of Egypt and Syria essentially complete, Yusuf could turn his attention to the great objective that had motivated Islamic resistance to the Crusades from the very beginning: the liberation of Jerusalem and the other territories that had been occupied by the Frankish kingdoms. But this was not simply a matter of military conquest, though military force would certainly be necessary. It required a fundamental transformation in the way Muslims thought about themselves and their place in the world, a rediscovery of the confidence and sense of divine mission that had driven the early Islamic conquests. This transformation was already beginning to occur throughout the territories under Yusuf's control, as his policies of religious tolerance combined with Sunni orthodoxy created an atmosphere in which Islamic scholarship and devotion could flourish without the sectarian tensions that had weakened previous regimes. The great madrasas of Cairo and Damascus were attracting students from throughout the Islamic world, while Sufi orders were spreading a mystical understanding of Islam that could inspire extraordinary devotion and sacrifice. Perhaps more importantly, Yusuf's success in unifying Egypt and Syria had demonstrated that the fragmentation that had plagued the Islamic world for generations was not inevitable, that skillful leadership could create larger and more effective political structures without destroying the diversity that had always been one of Islam's great strengths. This demonstration effect was beginning to influence rulers and populations far beyond the boundaries of Yusuf's direct authority, as Muslims from Spain to Central Asia began to hope that the age of division and weakness might finally be coming to an end. The opportunity to test these new realities came sooner than anyone expected, as a dispute over water rights near the Sea of Galilee escalated into exactly the kind of border incident that had often led to larger conflicts in the past. Reynald of Châtillon, the impetuous lord of Kerak, had attacked a Muslim caravan in violation of existing truces, killing merchants and pilgrims whose safety had been guaranteed by formal agreements between the Islamic and Crusader authorities. In earlier times, such incidents had typically led to limited retaliatory raids that accomplished little beyond perpetuating a cycle of violence and mistrust. But Yusuf understood that this particular violation offered an opportunity to transform the entire strategic situation in the Levant, provided that he could respond in a way that demonstrated both Islamic unity and military superiority, while maintaining the moral authority that was essential for success in what would inevitably be presented as a religious war. The army that assembled for the campaign of 1187 was unlike anything that had been seen in the Middle East for generations. Egyptian Mamluks rode alongside Syrian cavalry. Kurdish tribal levies marched with Turkmen horse archers, and Arab infantry carried the banners of a dozen different cities and regions that had set aside their traditional rivalries in service of a common cause. This was not just the army of a particular ruler, but the expression of a renewed Islamic consciousness that transcended the ethnic and regional divisions that had weakened Muslim resistance for so long. The size of this army was impressive, perhaps 30,000 men, making it the largest Muslim force assembled since the early days of the Crusades. But even more impressive was its morale and sense of purpose, as soldiers who might once have fought each other now prepared to face the common enemy with a unity of spirit that their opponents would find impossible to match. The green banners of Islam flew over contingents that represented every major population group in the region, while the black banner of the Abbasid Caliphate marked this as a campaign authorized by the highest religious authority in Sunni Islam. The march into Palestine was conducted with the methodical precision that had become characteristic of Yusuf's military operations. Supply lines were carefully established and protected. Intelligence networks provided detailed information about enemy movements and intentions, and diplomatic initiatives kept potential allies neutral while isolating the Crusader states from their traditional sources of support. This was not the impulsive raid of a desert chieftain, but the carefully planned campaign of a mature state capable of projecting power across vast distances while maintaining the logistical support necessary for sustained operations. The Crusader response revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the Frankish military system that had dominated the region for nearly a century. King Guy of Jerusalem was able to assemble a formidable army that included virtually every available knight and man-at-arms from the four Crusader states, along with substantial contingents from the military orders whose fighting qualities were legendary throughout Christendom. This force numbered perhaps 20,000 men, smaller than Yusuf's army, but including a higher proportion of heavily armored cavalry whose shock power had decided so many previous battles. But the Christian army also reflected the political divisions that had weakened the Crusader states during their decades of prosperity and relative security. The various nobles who commanded different contingents had personal rivalries that dated back years or even decades, while strategic disagreements about how to respond to the Muslim threat had created factions that could barely cooperate even in the face of existential danger. Most fatally, the army's commanders had failed to develop new tactics to deal with the kind of coordinated, professional force that Yusuf had created, continuing to rely on methods that had worked against the divided and often amateur Muslim armies of earlier generations. The confrontation that would decide the fate of the Crusader states took place on a landscape that seemed designed by Providence to illustrate the larger themes of the conflict. The twin hills known as the Horns of Hattin rose from the Palestinian plain like ancient monuments, their barren slopes dotted with the ruins of earlier civilizations that had fought and fallen on this same ground. To the west lay the Sea of Galilee, its blue waters shimmering in the summer heat, while to the east stretched the desert that had been the homeland of so many of the warriors now preparing for battle. The battle itself unfolded with the inexorable logic of a mathematical proof, as each phase revealed the consequences of the strategic choices that both sides had made during the months and years leading up to this moment. The Crusader army, burdened by heavy armor and equipment, struggled to maintain cohesion during the long march across waterless terrain, while Yusuf's forces, lighter and more mobile, were able to control the pace and location of contact. The heat became an ally to the Muslim forces, as the Christian knights found their steel armor transformed into furnaces that drained their strength with every hour that passed. The carefully managed water supplies that Yusuf had arranged for his own troops became a decisive advantage, while the Christian army's growing thirst weakened both their physical capabilities and their morale as the reality of their situation began to dawn. But perhaps most importantly, the battle demonstrated the transformation that had occurred in Muslim military thinking under Yusuf's leadership. Rather than relying on the kind of massed charges that had often failed against disciplined Christian formations, the Islamic forces coordinated their movements with the precision of a single organism, using archery and mobility to wear down their opponents, while avoiding the kind of costly frontal assaults that had wasted so many lives in earlier campaigns. The climax came as the summer sun reached its zenith, transforming the battlefield into a furnace where men fought as much against heat and thirst as against human enemies. The Christian formations, so formidable at the beginning of the day, began to fragment as individual knights and units sought water and shade that could not be found. The disciplined ranks that had held firm through hours of arrow storms finally broke, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a gradual dissolution that left survivors scattered across the hillsides, like leaves blown by an autumn wind. The victory at Hattin was complete, but it was also merciful in ways that surprised Christian observers and enhanced Yusuf's reputation throughout both the Islamic and Christian worlds. The common soldiers who surrendered were treated with a consideration that contrasted sharply with the usual customs of medieval warfare, while captured nobles were held for ransom under conditions that resembled honored detention more than imprisonment. Only the members of the military orders, those warrior monks whose vows precluded the kind of political accommodation that might have made their release possible, faced execution, and even this was carried out with a solemnity that acknowledged their courage, if not their cause. Most significantly, King Guy of Jerusalem and the other great nobles who had been captured were treated not as criminals, but as fallen enemies whose defeat had been ordained by divine will rather than human malice. Yusuf's personal interactions with these prisoners revealed the courtesy and dignity that would become hallmarks of his reputation, as he demonstrated that victory in battle did not require the abandonment of the ethical principles that distinguished civilization from barbarism. The immediate consequence of Hattin was the collapse of Crusader military power throughout Palestine and southern Syria, as fortress after fortress opened its gates to Yusuf's advancing armies, rather than face the kind of siege that could result in the destruction of entire populations. The psychological impact of the great victory had been even more important than its immediate military results, as Christian defenders throughout the region concluded that continued resistance was both futile and potentially catastrophic. But for Yusuf himself, The victory at Hattin was less an end than a beginning, the achievement of a necessary prerequisite for the much larger objectives that had been driving his policies for years. The destruction of Crusader military power had cleared the way for the restoration of Islamic control over the holy places that had been the ultimate goal of Muslim resistance from the very beginning. Most importantly, it had opened the road to Jerusalem, the city whose liberation would symbolize the renewal of Islamic civilization and the vindication of nearly a century of struggle and sacrifice. The approach to Jerusalem was conducted with the same methodical care that had characterized the entire campaign, as Yusuf understood that the symbolic importance of the city required that its conquest be accomplished in a way that would enhance rather than diminish his reputation for justice and magnanimity. The small garrison that remained in the city was hopelessly outnumbered, but they were also defending what Christians throughout the world considered the holiest site on earth, the place where Christ had died and risen again. The negotiations that preceded the city's surrender were as delicate and complex as any diplomatic exchange in medieval history, as both sides understood that the manner of Jerusalem's transition from Christian to Muslim control would influence relationships between the two religions for generations to come. Yusuf's representatives made it clear that the city's inhabitants would be allowed to leave safely, taking their portable possessions with them, while the holy sites of all three monotheistic religions would be protected and maintained under the new administration. The entry into Jerusalem on October 2nd, 1187, was orchestrated as a conscious counterpoint to the brutal conquest that had marked the Christian capture of the city 88 years earlier, when Crusader armies had massacred thousands of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants in what Christian chroniclers themselves described as an orgy of religiously motivated violence. Yusuf's occupation was marked by exactly the kind of restraint and magnanimity that enhanced his reputation throughout both the Islamic and Christian worlds, as churches were protected, civilian populations were left unmolested, and even the military orders that had fought against him were allowed to conduct an orderly evacuation. The restoration of Islamic control over the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, those architectural jewels that marked the site from which the Prophet Muhammad had ascended to heaven during his night journey, was celebrated throughout the Muslim world as a sign that the age of weakness and division was finally ending. But Yusuf's approach to these celebrations was characteristically thoughtful and restrained, as he understood that excessive triumphalism might provoke exactly the kind of Christian backlash that could undo everything he had accomplished. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves throughout Christian Europe that would ultimately lead to the Third Crusade, the greatest military effort that medieval Christendom would mount in its attempts to regain the holy places. But the immediate response was a mixture of disbelief and despair, as European rulers struggled to comprehend how the seemingly permanent Christian presence in the Holy Land had collapsed so suddenly and completely. For Yusuf, the months following the conquest of Jerusalem were a time of consolidation and preparation, as he worked to transform military victory into lasting political achievement while preparing for the inevitable Christian counterattack. The territories that had been liberated from Crusader control needed new administrative structures that could provide the security and prosperity necessary to maintain popular support, while the military forces that had won such spectacular victories needed to be maintained and expanded to meet the much larger challenges that lay ahead. The news that reached Damascus in the spring of 1189 confirmed what everyone had expected, that the kings of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire were setting aside their traditional rivalries to organize the largest crusading expedition since the capture of Jerusalem by the First Crusade. This Third Crusade would bring together the flower of European chivalry under leaders whose military reputations were already legendary throughout Christendom. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. The prospect of facing such formidable opponents might have daunted a lesser leader, but Yusuf understood that the Third Crusade also represented an opportunity for him to prove himself as a leader, opportunity to demonstrate that the Islamic revival he had initiated was capable of withstanding the greatest challenges that its enemies could mount. The scattered and often amateur armies that had constituted Muslim resistance in earlier generations had been replaced by professional forces whose training, equipment, and morale could match anything that Christian Europe could produce. More importantly, the political and religious unity that Yusuf had created throughout Egypt and Syria meant that Muslim resistance would no longer be hobbled by the kind of divisions and rivalries that had made earlier Crusader victories possible. The green banners of Islam that flew from Cairo to Aleppo represented not just military alliance, but a genuine revival of the sense of common purpose that had driven the early Islamic conquests. The arrival of the Crusader armies was preceded by months of diplomatic maneuvering, as both sides sought to gain advantages through negotiation that might reduce the costs of what everyone understood would be a titanic military struggle. Yusuf's reputation for honorable dealing, established during his conquest of Jerusalem and reinforced by his treatment of Christian prisoners and populations, made him someone with whom even his enemies could negotiate without losing face or compromising their principles. These diplomatic exchanges revealed the extent to which Yusuf had transformed himself from a regional military commander into a statesman whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of his own territories. European rulers who had never set foot in the Holy Land sought his agreement to truces and safe conducts, while Christian merchants who had lost fortunes during the conquest of the Crusader states petitioned him for the restoration of their trading privileges. But perhaps most significantly, these negotiations demonstrated that Yusuf had developed a sophisticated understanding of European politics and psychology that allowed him to exploit the divisions between different Christian factions while maintaining his own moral authority. His willingness to release high-ranking prisoners in exchange for political concessions, his protection of Christian pilgrims and merchants, and his careful respect for Christian religious sensibilities all served to complicate European efforts to present the conflict as a simple struggle between good and evil. The confrontation between Yusuf and Richard the Lionheart, when it finally materialized, proved to be everything that contemporary observers had anticipated and more. These were two of the greatest military leaders of their age, men whose tactical genius and personal courage had already become legendary. Meeting in a contest that would determine not just the fate of the Holy Land, but the future relationship between Christianity and Islam in the Eastern Mediterranean. Richard's reputation as a warrior was almost superhuman, based on a series of victories in France and Sicily that had demonstrated both his individual prowess and his ability to lead men in the most desperate circumstances. His arrival in the Holy Land with a fleet that darkened the sea and an army that included the best knights from England, France, and Italy marked the beginning of a new phase in the struggle, one in which both sides understood that compromise might no longer be possible. The siege of Acre became the focal point for this renewed conflict, as the Crusader forces established themselves in strongly fortified positions, while Yusuf's armies attempted to break their supply lines and force them to abandon their offensive. For months, the two armies faced each other across fortifications that grew stronger and more elaborate with each passing week, while both sides maneuvered for the kind of decisive advantage that could break the deadlock without requiring the enormous casualties that a direct assault would have entailed. The psychological warfare that accompanied this military standoff was as important as the battles themselves, as both leaders understood that their reputations for invincibility were weapons as valuable as swords or siege engines. Richard's dramatic gestures, his personal leadership of cavalry charges, his challenges to single combat, his ostentatious displays of wealth and power, were designed to demoralize Muslim resistance by suggesting that Christian victory was both inevitable and divinely ordained. Yusuf's response was characteristically subtle and sophisticated, as he sought to counter Richard's psychological warfare without falling into the trap of trying to match his opponent's theatrical style. Rather than attempting to compete with the Lionheart's personal dramatics, he demonstrated a different kind of leadership, one based on strategic patience, careful planning, and above all, the kind of moral authority that came from consistent adherence to principles that transcended immediate military advantage. The respect that developed between these two great opponents was one of the most remarkable features of their conflict, as each came to recognize in the other qualities that commanded admiration even across the barriers of religion and culture. Their personal encounters, whether on the battlefield or at the negotiating table, were marked by a courtesy and mutual recognition that impressed observers on both sides and helped to establish standards of conduct that would influence medieval warfare for generations to come. The military campaign that unfolded around Acre and the other coastal cities demonstrated that both the Christian and Islamic military systems had evolved significantly since the early days of the Crusades. Richard's forces combined traditional heavy cavalry with innovations in siege warfare and naval tactics that made them far more formidable than their predecessors, while Yusuf's armies had developed new methods of coordinated infantry and cavalry operations that could hold their own against the best that Christian Europe could produce. But perhaps more importantly, the Third Crusade revealed that the conflict between Christianity and Islam in the Holy Land had evolved beyond a simple military struggle into something approaching a diplomatic dance, in which both sides maneuvered for advantage through negotiation as much as through battle. The frequent truces, prisoner exchanges, and commercial agreements that punctuated the military campaigns demonstrated that even the most committed enemies could find ways to coexist when their practical interests aligned. The culmination of the Third Crusade came not in a dramatic military victory for either side, but in a negotiated settlement that reflected the fundamental balance of forces that had emerged over the course of 3 years of intermittent warfare. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed in September 1192, was a masterpiece of diplomatic compromise that allowed both leaders to claim success while acknowledging the realities that made total victory impossible for either side. Under the terms of this agreement, the Crusaders retained control of a narrow coastal strip stretching from Tyre to Jaffa, while Yusuf maintained his authority over Jerusalem and the vast majority of the territories that had been liberated during his earlier campaigns. Most importantly, the treaty established principles for the treatment of pilgrims and merchants that would allow people from both religions to visit and conduct business in the holy places that meant so much to their respective faiths. For Yusuf, the Treaty of Jaffa represented the achievement of objectives that had seemed impossible when he first entered Egyptian politics as a young man following his uncle Shirkuh. He had not only survived the greatest military challenge that Christian Europe could mount, but had established himself as an equal partner in a diplomatic settlement that recognized Islamic sovereignty over the vast majority of the territories that the Crusaders had once controlled. More importantly, the treaty marked the international recognition of the Islamic revival that Yusuf had led, as the greatest powers of medieval Europe acknowledged that the age of easy Christian victories in the East was over, and that future relationships would have to be based on mutual respect rather than unilateral domination. The green banners of Islam that flew over Jerusalem and Damascus were no longer symbols of temporary conquest, but markers of a renewed civilization that had proven its ability to defend itself against the greatest challenges its enemies could mount. The years following the Third Crusade were characterized by a kind of exhausted peace, as both sides worked to consolidate their gains while recovering from the enormous costs of their prolonged conflict. For Yusuf, this period provided an opportunity to focus on the constructive aspects of statecraft that had always been as important to him as military success. The development of trade and agriculture, the patronage of learning and the arts, and the creation of legal and administrative systems that could provide security and prosperity for the diverse populations under his authority. The economic revival that occurred throughout Yusuf's territories during these peaceful years demonstrated the benefits that could flow from political stability and religious tolerance. Egyptian agriculture, freed from the disruptions of constant warfare, began to produce the surpluses that had made the country wealthy in earlier times, while Syrian cities resumed their traditional role as entrepôts for trade between Europe and Asia. The merchants who had fled during the years of conflict began to return, bringing with them the capital and expertise necessary to restore the commercial networks that connected the Eastern Mediterranean with markets stretching from Spain to India. Perhaps more importantly, the peace allowed for a cultural and intellectual flowering that recalled the great achievements of the early Islamic centuries. The madrasas and libraries that Yusuf had established or expanded throughout his territories began to attract scholars from throughout the Islamic world, creating centers of learning that rivaled the great institutions of Baghdad and Cordoba. The translation movement that had slowed during the years of conflict resumed with new energy as Arabic-speaking scholars worked to preserve and transmit the philosophical and scientific heritage of antiquity while developing new approaches to the challenges of their own age. Yusuf himself took an active role in this intellectual revival, not merely as a patron, but as a participant who understood that military and political success meant little if they were not accompanied by achievements in learning and culture that could inspire future generations. He sponsored the copying of manuscripts, the construction of observatories, and the establishment of hospitals that incorporated the latest advances in medical knowledge. His court became a gathering place for poets and historians, theologians and scientists, creating an atmosphere of intellectual ferment that influenced developments throughout the medieval world. The personal relationships that Yusuf developed during these years revealed aspects of his character that the demands of war and politics had often kept hidden. His correspondence with scholars and Sufi masters showed a genuine interest in questions of philosophy and mysticism that went far beyond the requirements of political necessity, while his interactions with merchants and craftsmen demonstrated a practical understanding of economic issues that helped to explain his success in governing such diverse territories. Most touchingly, the sources from this period reveal Yusuf's growing concerns about his own mortality and the future of the achievements he had worked so hard to create. He was entering his 50s, an advanced age by medieval standards, and the years of constant campaigning had taken their toll on his health. The tremor in his hands that observers began to notice, the increasing frequency of minor illnesses, and the gradual delegation of military responsibilities to younger commanders all suggested that the great Sultan was beginning to prepare for the transition that awaited every mortal ruler. The question of succession became increasingly urgent as Yusuf's health problems multiplied. But it was also extraordinarily complex given the nature of the state he had created. Unlike the traditional Islamic dynasties that had relied primarily on hereditary succession within a single family, Yusuf's empire was held together by a combination of personal loyalty, shared religious commitment, and practical self-interest that would be difficult for any successor to replicate. His sons were capable men who had been trained in the arts of war and statecraft, but none of them possessed the unique combination of qualities that had made their father's extraordinary career possible. His brothers and nephews had proven themselves as military commanders and provincial governors, but the idea of dividing the empire among multiple claimants raised the spectre of exactly the kind of fratricidal conflict that had weakened so many previous Islamic dynasties. Yusuf's solution to this dilemma reflected the political wisdom he had developed over decades of experience in the treacherous waters of medieval statecraft. Rather than attempting to designate a single heir who might face challenges from other family members, he began to create a system of shared authority that could preserve the unity of the empire while providing multiple centers of legitimate power. Egypt would go to one son, Damascus to another, while Aleppo and the other major cities would be governed by trusted relatives who acknowledged the overall authority of the senior branch of the family. This arrangement was formalized in a series of agreements that were as much diplomatic treaties between allied states as they were family settlements, acknowledging that the empire Yusuf had created was too large and diverse to be ruled effectively by any single individual, regardless of his abilities. The system of federated authority that emerged from these negotiations would prove remarkably durable, maintaining the essential unity of the Islamic revival, while allowing for the kind of flexibility that made adaptation to changing circumstances possible. As his 60th year approached, Yusuf began to spend more time in contemplation and prayer, seeking to understand the meaning of his extraordinary life and to prepare himself for the ultimate journey that awaited every soul. The mosque that had been built adjacent to his palace in Damascus became his favorite retreat, a place where he could escape from the pressing demands of governance and diplomacy to focus on the spiritual dimensions of existence that had always been as important to him as worldly success. The routine of his final years took on an almost monastic regularity as he divided his time between the essential duties of rulership and the spiritual exercises that prepared him for the afterlife. He rose before dawn for the first prayer of the day, spent the morning hours in consultations with advisors and the reception of petitions, devoted his afternoons to correspondence and the review of administrative reports, and reserved his evenings for study and meditation on the great questions of faith and mortality that had occupied Islamic thinkers for centuries. His correspondence from this period reveals a man who had found peace with the choices he had made and the consequences they had produced, but who also understood that earthly achievements, however spectacular, were temporary by their very nature. The cities he had conquered would eventually fall to other conquerors. The administrative systems he had created would be modified or replaced by his successors. And even the religious revival he had led would eventually give way to new forms of Islamic expression, better adapted to the needs of future generations. What would endure, he believed, were the principles he had tried to embody throughout his career. The commitment to justice that transcended religious and ethnic divisions, the combination of strength and mercy that distinguished true leadership from mere domination, and above all, the understanding that power was a trust from God that had to be exercised in service of the broader human community rather than for personal aggrandizement. The illness that would prove fatal began in the early months of 1193 as what seemed like a minor fever, the kind of ailment that had troubled him periodically for years without causing serious concern. But this time, the fever persisted, accompanied by weakness and pain that gradually made it impossible for him to maintain his usual routine of audiences and administrative oversight. As the weeks passed and his condition worsened, it became clear that the great Sultan was facing the ultimate test that no amount of military skill or political acumen could help him avoid. The final days were spent in his chamber overlooking the ancient gardens of Damascus, where the scent of jasmine and orange blossoms drifted through windows that framed views of the minarets and domes that marked the city's skyline. The room itself was simply furnished, as befitted a man who had never sought luxury for its own sake, containing only the essential items needed for prayer, study, and the reception of the visitors who came to pay their respects to the dying Sultan. His family gathered around him during these last weeks, sons and brothers, nephews and trusted companions who had shared the extraordinary journey that had taken them from the banks of the Tigris to the corridors of power in the greatest cities of the Islamic world. The conversations that took place in that quiet chamber covered the practical arrangements that would be necessary after his death, but they also touched on deeper questions about the meaning of their shared experience and the responsibilities that would fall to those who survived him. Yusuf's final instructions to his successors were characteristically thoughtful and far-sighted, focusing not on the preservation of his personal legacy, but on the continuation of the work that had defined his life. The territories he had united should remain united if possible, but not at the cost of destructive civil wars that would undo everything he had accomplished. The various religious and ethnic communities that had found security under his rule should continue to enjoy the protection and tolerance that had made his empire a model for others to follow. Above all, the struggle for justice and righteousness that had motivated the Islamic revival should continue, even if it took different forms than those he had pioneered. The scholars and Sufi masters who visited him during his final illness found a man who faced death with the same calm dignity that had characterized his approach to life's greatest challenges. He spoke of his impending journey to the afterlife, not with fear or regret, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had tried to live according to divine guidance and who trusted in God's mercy to make up for his inevitable human failings. His concern for his subjects continued even as his strength faded, as he insisted on being informed about administrative matters and diplomatic developments that might affect their welfare. The irrigation systems that brought life to the Syrian countryside, the trade agreements that maintained the prosperity of Egyptian merchants, the delicate balance of relationships with Christian neighbors, all of these remained important to him, even as his own participation in worldly affairs was obviously coming to an end. The last coherent words that witnesses recorded were a prayer for the continued unity and prosperity of the Islamic world, combined with a request for God's forgiveness for any injustices he might have committed during his years of power. Those who heard these final utterances were struck by their complete absence of personal pride or self-congratulation, reflecting a spiritual humility that had always coexisted with his worldly achievements. Death came on March 4th, 1193, in the early hours of morning, when the call to the first prayer of the day was echoing across the sleeping city. Those who were present reported that his passing was peaceful, marked by no struggle or apparent suffering, as if he were simply falling into the deepest and most restful sleep of his life. The hand that had once wielded the sword that liberated Jerusalem lay still at last, while outside the windows of his chamber, the eternal rhythms of the city he had loved continued unchanged. The immediate aftermath of Yusuf's death revealed the extent to which his personal authority had held together the complex coalition of interests that constituted his empire. The various succession agreements he had negotiated with his family members were implemented with remarkable smoothness, suggesting that his political legacy would prove as durable as his military achievements. But there were also signs of the tensions and ambitions that would eventually lead to the fragmentation he had worked so hard to prevent, as different family members and regional commanders began to maneuver for advantage in the new dispensation. The funeral ceremonies that marked the end of the great Sultan's earthly journey were conducted with a simplicity that would have pleased him, avoiding the kind of ostentatious display that had characterized the obsequies of earlier rulers. His body was interred in a modest tomb adjacent to the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, where visitors could come to pray for his soul and reflect on the extraordinary life that had ended in that quiet chamber overlooking the gardens. The immediate impact of Yusuf's death was felt throughout the Middle East and beyond, as rulers and peoples struggled to understand what his passing might mean for the delicate balance of forces that had emerged during his lifetime. Christian leaders who had fought against him acknowledged his greatness even as they hoped that his successors would prove less formidable, while Muslim populations from Spain to Central Asia mourned the loss of a leader who had restored their confidence in themselves and their faith. But perhaps the most significant immediate consequence was the recognition among both enemies and allies that an age was ending. The world that had produced figures like Yusuf ibn Ayyub, a world where individual leadership could still reshape the political map, where religious devotion and military prowess could combine to create new forms of civilization, where the boundaries between cultures remained fluid enough to allow for mutual influence and accommodation, was slowly giving way to something different and in many ways less inspiring. The years that followed Yusuf's death saw the gradual implementation of the succession arrangements he had established, as his sons and brothers took control of the various territories that had constituted his empire. The system of federated authority that emerged from these transitions proved remarkably successful in maintaining the essential unity of his achievements, while allowing for the kind of local adaptation that changing circumstances required. Al-Afdal, his eldest son, assumed control of Damascus and the Syrian heartland, bringing to his new responsibilities the military training and administrative experience that his father had insisted upon for all potential successors. His brothers received Egypt and the other major centers of power, while trusted relatives and companions were confirmed in their governance of smaller cities and provinces. The network of relationships that had held the empire together during Yusuf's lifetime continued to function, though inevitably with less authority and cohesion than had been possible under the founder's personal leadership. The most immediate test of this new system came from external challenges, as both Christian and rival Muslim powers sought to exploit what they assumed would be the weakness and confusion that typically followed the death of a great ruler. The Crusader states, despite their reduced circumstances, still controlled important coastal territories and harbored ambitions to reverse the losses they had suffered during Yusuf's lifetime. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad watched nervously as the Ayyubid succession unfolded, uncertain whether the new rulers would continue their predecessors' policies of nominal deference to caliphal authority. But perhaps the most significant challenge came from within the Islamic world itself, as rival dynasties and ambitious commanders wondered whether the time had come to challenge Ayyubid hegemony in Syria and Egypt. The Zengids, who had never fully accepted their displacement by Yusuf's family, began to probe for weaknesses in the new arrangements. Local governors and tribal chiefs, whose loyalty had been secured by personal relationships with the great Sultan, tested the commitment and capabilities of his successors. The response to these challenges revealed that Yusuf's political legacy was more robust than his critics had hoped or his admirers had feared. The administrative systems he had created continued to function effectively, providing the resources necessary to maintain military forces capable of defending the empire's borders. The religious and cultural unity he had fostered among his diverse subjects provided a foundation of popular support that no external enemy could easily undermine. Most importantly, the military traditions he had established, the emphasis on disciplined professionalism over individual heroics, the integration of different types of forces into coordinated armies, the combination of strategic patience with tactical aggression, proved as effective in the hands of his successors as they had been during his own campaigns. The first major test came in 1194, less than a year after Yusuf's death, when a coalition of Crusader forces attempted to recapture some of the coastal cities that had been lost during the great campaigns of the previous decade. The response was swift and decisive, as Al-Afdal demonstrated that he had inherited not only his father's territories, but also his military skills. The Christian offensive was repelled with losses that convinced European observers that the Ayyubid state remained formidable despite the change in leadership. Similar tests from Muslim rivals produced equally convincing demonstrations that the empire's military capabilities had not died with its founder. The Zengid attempt to reclaim Aleppo was defeated through a combination of diplomatic isolation and military pressure that recalled Yusuf's own methods, while tribal rebellions in the desert borderlands were suppressed with the kind of swift, decisive action that had characterized his approach to such challenges. But perhaps more impressive than these military successes was the continued development of the cultural and intellectual achievements that had flourished under Yusuf's patronage. The madrasas and libraries he had established continued to attract students and scholars from throughout the Islamic world, while the legal and administrative innovations pioneered during his reign were adopted by rulers in distant territories who recognized their practical value. The economic prosperity that had returned to Syria and Egypt during the peaceful years of Yusuf's later reign continued to expand under his successors, as merchants and craftsmen gained confidence in the stability of the new arrangements. Trade routes that had been disrupted by decades of warfare were fully restored, connecting the eastern Mediterranean with markets stretching from Western Europe to the Indian Ocean. The agricultural improvements that Yusuf had sponsored, new irrigation systems, the introduction of improved crop varieties, the settlement of previously unused lands, began to produce their full benefits as peasant families felt secure enough to make long-term investments in their holdings. This economic revival had important political consequences, as it provided the tax revenues necessary to maintain the military forces that defended the empire, while also funding the charitable and educational institutions that legitimized Ayyubid rule in the eyes of ordinary subjects. The hospitals and schools, the soup kitchens and hostels for travelers, the mosques and libraries that had been established during Yusuf's lifetime continued to operate and expand, creating a network of social services that bound the various communities of the empire together in ways that transcended mere political allegiance. The diplomatic relationships that Yusuf had established with neighbors and rivals also proved durable, as his successors demonstrated the same combination of strength and restraint that had made their predecessor such an effective negotiator. Trade agreements with Italian city-states were renewed and expanded, while truces with the remaining Crusader territories were maintained despite occasional provocations from both sides. Even relationships with the Byzantine Empire, always complex given the territorial and religious issues that divided the two powers, continued to develop along the pragmatic lines that Yusuf had established. Perhaps most importantly, the system of relationships within the broader Islamic world that Yusuf had created continued to provide a framework for cooperation and mutual support that enhanced the security and prosperity of all participants. The network of alliances with Bedouin tribes, urban notables, religious leaders, and regional governors that had been the foundation of his power proved adaptable enough to survive the transition to new leadership, while maintaining the essential unity that had made his achievements possible. As the 10th anniversary of Yusuf's death approached, it became increasingly clear that his political and military legacy would endure in forms that he himself might not have anticipated, but would certainly have approved. The empire he had created was evolving into something more like a confederation of allied states than a centralized monarchy. But this evolution was occurring in ways that preserved the essential principles he had championed throughout his career: religious tolerance, administrative competence, military effectiveness, and above all, the commitment to justice that had made his rule legitimate in the eyes of subjects from many different backgrounds. The cultural and intellectual achievements of the Ayyubid period were also proving to have influences that extended far beyond the boundaries of the empire itself. The legal scholars who had been trained in the madrasas that Yusuf established were carrying their learning to distant territories, while the architectural and artistic innovations pioneered during his reign were being copied and adapted throughout the Islamic world. The historical chronicles and biographical works that celebrated his achievements were being read in libraries from Cordoba to Samarkand, inspiring new generations of Muslims to believe that their faith and civilization could achieve greatness even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. But perhaps the most lasting aspect of Yusuf's legacy was the transformation he had brought about in the way Muslims thought about themselves and their place in the world. The centuries of division and weakness that had preceded his rise to power had created a kind of psychological demoralization that had made Muslim defeats seem inevitable and Muslim victories appear to be temporary accidents. His career had demonstrated that Islamic civilization could still produce leaders capable of uniting diverse populations around common goals, of creating military forces that could defeat the best their enemies could offer, and of building political institutions that could provide security and prosperity for all their subjects, regardless of religion or ethnicity. This restoration of confidence had implications that extended far beyond the immediate military and political successes of his reign. Throughout the Islamic world, rulers and peoples were beginning to believe once again that they could control their own destinies, that the apparent dominance of Christian powers in some regions was not permanent or divinely ordained, and that the principles of their faith provided a foundation for achievements that could rival or exceed those of any other civilization. The ripple effects of this psychological transformation were already becoming visible in regions far from Syria and Egypt, as Muslim rulers from Spain to India began to adopt the military, administrative, and diplomatic innovations that had made Yusuf's success possible. The idea that Islamic unity was not just a theological ideal, but a practical political possibility, was inspiring new attempts at cooperation and coordination that would have been unthinkable during the fragmented period that had preceded his rise. As the second decade after Yusuf's death began, his successors faced new challenges that tested their ability to adapt his methods to changing circumstances. The Fourth Crusade, launched by European powers who hoped to reverse the gains that Islam had made during his lifetime, ultimately resulted in the conquest of Constantinople rather than the recovery of Jerusalem, demonstrating that the strategic balance in the Eastern Mediterranean had shifted decisively in favor of the Islamic world. This development created new opportunities for Ayyubid expansion, but it also required careful navigation of the complex relationships with the Byzantine Empire that had been one of Yusuf's most delicate diplomatic achievements. The fall of the Eastern Roman capital to Latin Crusaders created a power vacuum that various forces sought to fill, while the survival of Byzantine successor states in Anatolia and the Balkans meant that the traditional enemy remained formidable even in reduced circumstances. The Ayyubid response to these developments revealed the extent to which Yusuf's successors had internalized the strategic thinking that had guided his career. Rather than attempting to exploit Byzantine weakness through immediate military action, they chose to maintain the existing diplomatic relationships while carefully expanding their influence in regions where Christian authority had collapsed. This patient, long-term approach reflected the same combination of opportunism and restraint that had characterized their predecessors' most successful initiatives. The continued prosperity of Syria and Egypt during this period provided the resources necessary to pursue these expanded ambitions without overextending the empire's capabilities. The tax revenues generated by revived trade and agriculture allowed for the maintenance of larger military forces than had been possible during the early years of the Crusades, while the diplomatic relationships that Yusuf had established provided intelligence and support that reduced the risks inherent in any expansionist policy. More importantly, the religious and cultural unity that he had fostered among his subjects continued to provide a foundation of popular support that made sustained military campaigns possible without the kind of internal disruption that had plagued earlier Islamic dynasties. The various ethnic and religious communities within the empire had developed a stake in its success that transcended narrow communal interests, creating a form of patriotism that could inspire extraordinary sacrifices when circumstances required them. As the 20th anniversary of Yusuf's death approached, the durability of his achievements had become undeniable even to his harshest critics. The empire he had created not only survived, but had continued to grow in power and influence, while the cultural and intellectual revival he had sponsored was producing works of lasting value that enhanced the reputation of Islamic civilization throughout the known world. The military innovations he had pioneered were being adopted by armies from Spain to Central Asia, while his diplomatic methods were being studied and copied by rulers who recognized their practical effectiveness. But perhaps most importantly, the moral authority that had been the foundation of his personal success had become institutionalized in ways that provided legitimacy for his successors, even when they lacked his extraordinary personal qualities. The commitment to justice that had characterized his rule had become part of the political culture of the regions he had governed, creating expectations among subjects that constrained the arbitrary exercise of power, while encouraging the kind of administrative competence that made good government possible. The legal scholars and religious teachers who had flourished under his patronage were training new generations of officials and judges whose understanding of Islamic law and ethics provided a framework for governance that transcended the personal preferences of individual rulers. The hospitals and schools, the charitable foundations and public works that he had established continued to serve the needs of ordinary people in ways that demonstrated the practical benefits of Islamic rule, while creating constituencies that had strong interests in maintaining the stability of the system. The transformation of Jerusalem itself during the decades following its liberation provided perhaps the most visible symbol of the enduring nature of Yusuf's achievement. The city that had been recovered through his military genius had become once again a center of Islamic learning and devotion, attracting pilgrims and scholars from throughout the Muslim world who came to pray at the holy sites and to study in the institutions that had been restored under Ayyubid patronage. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, those architectural masterpieces that marked the site of the Prophet's night journey, had been carefully restored and embellished in ways that demonstrated both respect for their historical significance and confidence in the permanence of Islamic control. The surrounding neighborhoods had been rebuilt as centers of commerce and learning, with madrasas and libraries, markets and workshops that served the needs of a diverse population, while maintaining the special character that made Jerusalem unique among the cities of the world. The Christian and Jewish communities that had remained in Jerusalem under Islamic rule found themselves not merely tolerated, but actively protected, as Yusuf's successors continued his policy of religious pluralism that had been one of the most remarkable features of his reign. The churches and synagogues that served these minorities were maintained and protected, while their members enjoyed the same legal rights and economic opportunities as their Muslim neighbors. This policy of tolerance was not simply a matter of political calculation, though it certainly served practical purposes by maintaining the loyalty of important commercial and professional communities. It reflected a deeper understanding of Islamic principles that had been one of Yusuf's most significant intellectual achievements: the recognition that true faith could not be imposed by force, and that the diversity of human religious experience was part of divine providence rather than a challenge to Islamic supremacy. The intellectual and cultural achievements of the post-Saladin period were beginning to rival those of the early Abbasid era, as the political stability and economic prosperity that his policies had created provided the conditions necessary for sustained scholarly and artistic work. The madrasas of Cairo and Damascus were attracting students from as far away as Spain and India, while the libraries that had been established or expanded during his reign were becoming repositories of learning that preserved and transmitted the wisdom of earlier ages, while fostering new developments in philosophy, science, and literature. The translation movement that had been one of the glories of early Islamic civilization was experiencing a revival as scholars worked to make available in Arabic the philosophical and scientific works of antiquity, while also creating original contributions that advanced human knowledge in new directions. The medical schools that had been established in the great hospitals were training physicians whose skills were sought after throughout the Mediterranean world, while astronomers and mathematicians were making discoveries that would influence the development of these sciences for centuries to come. The architectural achievements of the period were equally impressive, as the wealth and confidence that characterized Ayyubid rule found expression in buildings that combined functional efficiency with aesthetic beauty in ways that had rarely been achieved in earlier Islamic architecture. The mosques and madrasas, the palaces and fortifications that were constructed during these years reflected a mature understanding of Islamic architectural principles that had been refined through centuries of experimentation and development. But perhaps most significantly, the literary achievements of the period were creating works that would define Islamic culture for future generations. The historical chronicles that recorded Yusuf's achievements were setting new standards for accuracy and literary quality that would influence the writing of history throughout the Islamic world, while the biographical works that celebrated his character and accomplishments were establishing models of leadership that would inspire Muslim rulers for centuries to come. The poetry that flourished under Ayyubid patronage combined traditional Arabic forms with new themes that reflected the changed circumstances of Islamic civilization, celebrating the military victories and cultural achievements of the period, while also exploring the spiritual and philosophical questions that had always been central to Islamic thought. The mystical literature that emerged from the Sufi orders that had been encouraged during Yusuf's reign was creating new forms of religious expression that would influence Islamic spirituality throughout the world. As the 25th anniversary of Yusuf's death approached, the full scope of his historical significance was becoming apparent to observers throughout the Middle East and beyond. He had not merely won military victories or conquered territories. though his achievements in these areas were certainly remarkable. He had transformed the fundamental character of Islamic civilization in ways that would influence its development for centuries to come, demonstrating that the principles of the faith could provide a foundation for political and cultural achievements that could rival those of any other tradition. The empire he had created was now entering its second generation of leadership, as his sons and grandsons took on the responsibilities of governance with the confidence that came from having inherited not just territories and resources, but proven methods for achieving success in the complex world of medieval politics. The institutions he had established were producing new leaders who combined military skill with administrative competence, religious devotion with intellectual sophistication, creating a governing class that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the essential principles that had made their predecessors successful. The diplomatic relationships that he had established with neighbors and rivals were providing a framework for international relations that reduced the likelihood of the kind of destructive conflicts that had characterized earlier periods. The network of trade agreements and political understandings that connected the Ayyubid Empire with powers throughout the Mediterranean world was creating interdependencies that made war less attractive while providing opportunities for the kind of cultural exchange that enriched all participants. The religious and cultural tolerance that had been one of the hallmarks of his rule was becoming a model that influenced the policies of rulers throughout the Islamic world, demonstrating that diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness when it was managed with wisdom and restraint. The various religious and ethnic communities that had found security under Ayyubid protection were contributing their talents and resources to the broader enterprise of Islamic civilization in ways that enhanced its achievements while preserving their own distinctive traditions. The military innovations that he had pioneered were being adopted by armies throughout the region, creating a new generation of Islamic military forces that could compete effectively with any enemy they might face. The combination of disciplined professionalism with tactical flexibility that had been the hallmark of his campaigns was producing victories that demonstrated the continued vitality of Islamic civilization even in the face of sustained external pressure. But perhaps most importantly, the moral authority that had been the foundation of his personal success was becoming institutionalized in ways that provided guidance for future generations of leaders. The understanding of Islamic principles that had informed his policies was being preserved and transmitted through the educational institutions he had established, while the example of his personal conduct was inspiring new generations of Muslims to believe that they could achieve greatness while remaining faithful to the highest ideals of their tradition. The 30th anniversary of Yusuf's death in 1223 was marked by ceremonies throughout the territories that had once formed his empire, as his successors and their subjects paused to remember the extraordinary man whose vision and leadership had transformed their world. The prayers that were offered in the mosques of Cairo and Damascus, Jerusalem and Aleppo recalled not just his military victories, but his commitment to justice, his protection of the weak, and his dedication to the principles that made Islamic civilization a force for good in the world. The scholars who gathered in the madrasas he had established to discuss his legacy found themselves grappling with questions that would occupy historians for centuries to come. How had a Kurdish chieftain's son from a small city in Iraq managed to unite territories stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates under a single banner? What combination of personal qualities and historical circumstances had made possible achievements that seemed almost miraculous in their scope and durability? What lessons could future leaders learn from his example as they faced the challenges of their own times? The answers to these questions were as complex as the man himself, reflecting the multiple dimensions of his character and the extraordinary circumstances in which he had lived and worked. His military genius was undeniable, but it had been combined with political skills that were even more remarkable, allowing him to build coalitions that transcended the ethnic and religious divisions that had fragmented the Islamic world for generations. His personal piety was genuine and deep, but it had been expressed through policies of tolerance and inclusion that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Islamic principles rather than the kind of narrow sectarianism that had weakened his predecessors. Perhaps most importantly, he had possessed the rare ability to combine immediate tactical success with long-term strategic vision, winning the battles that were necessary to achieve his objectives while building the institutions and relationships that could preserve his achievements for future generations. The empire he had created was not simply the product of military conquest, but the result of careful construction that had taken into account the needs and aspirations of all the diverse communities that constituted his subjects. As the fourth decade after Yusuf's death began, the Islamic world was facing new challenges that tested the durability of the foundations he had laid. The Mongol invasions that were beginning to transform the political landscape of Asia posed threats that were different in both scale and character from anything that previous generations of Muslim leaders had confronted. The technological and organizational innovations that were emerging from the interaction between Islamic, Christian, and other civilizations were creating new possibilities and new dangers that required adaptations of traditional methods and approaches. But the fundamental principles that Yusuf had embodied in his policies and his personal conduct continued to provide guidance for those who sought to preserve and develop Islamic civilization in the face of these new challenges. The commitment to justice that had been the foundation of his legitimacy remained as relevant as ever, while the combination of military effectiveness with diplomatic sophistication that had characterized his approach to international relations provided a model that could be adapted to changing circumstances. The institutions he had created were proving their value as frameworks for addressing new problems while preserving the essential continuity of Islamic culture and values. The madrasas and hospitals, the legal and administrative systems, the military and diplomatic structures that had been established during his reign were evolving in response to new needs while maintaining the core principles that had made them effective in the first place. Most importantly, the confidence that his achievements had restored to Islamic civilization was providing the psychological foundation for the kind of creative adaptation that would be necessary to meet the challenges of the changing world. The demonstration that Islamic principles could provide a basis for political and military success, cultural and intellectual achievement, and social justice and prosperity had created a reservoir of self-confidence that enabled Muslims throughout the world to believe in their ability to shape their own destinies, rather than simply responding to external pressures. And so, as the years passed and new generations took up the responsibilities of leadership, the memory of Yusuf ibn Ayyub continued to inspire and guide those who sought to build upon the foundations he had laid. In the quiet moments when rulers and scholars, soldiers and merchants paused to reflect on the meaning of their work and the direction of their civilization, his example provided both inspiration and practical guidance for the choices they faced. The sun was beginning to rise over the ancient walls of Damascus, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires for thousands of years. In the gardens beneath the citadel, where Yusuf had spent his final days, the fountains continued their eternal song, while the scent of jasmine and orange blossoms filled the morning air with fragrances that connected the present moment with all the mornings that had come before. Somewhere in those gardens, if you listened carefully, you might still hear the echoes of footsteps that had once walked these paths in contemplation and prayer, seeking to understand the meaning of power and responsibility, of success and mortality, of the eternal principles that transcend the temporary achievements of any single life. The man who had been known to history as Saladin, who had been called the rightness of the faith by his own people and the greatest of his enemies by those who had fought against him, had found in these quiet spaces the peace that comes from knowing that one has lived according to the highest ideals of one's tradition while serving the needs of all humanity. The dawn light was spreading now across the desert that stretched endlessly beyond the city walls, touching the distant mountains where nomad tribes still followed the ancient paths of their ancestors, illuminating the river valleys where farmers were already beginning the daily work that had sustained civilization since the beginning of time. It was the same light that had witnessed the birth of a Kurdish chieftain's son in Tikrit more than 60 years before, that had seen his education in the arts of war and peace, his rise to power in the courts of Damascus and Cairo, his victories on the battlefields of Palestine and Syria, and finally his peaceful death in the chamber overlooking the gardens, where his memory would be preserved for as long as men remembered the possibility of greatness achieved in service of justice and faith. The muezzin's call to morning prayer was beginning to echo from the minarets of the great mosque, joining his voice with those of countless others throughout the city and beyond, creating a symphony of devotion that connected the present moment with the eternal truths that transcend time and place. In that call, those who listened carefully could hear the echo of all the prayers that Yusuf ibn Ayyub had offered during his long life, his requests for guidance in the face of impossible choices, his gratitude for victories achieved and mercy shown, his hopes for a world in which the principles of his faith could provide a foundation for peace and prosperity for all the children of Abraham. The light continued to spread, touching the walls of Jerusalem where the dome of the rock caught the first rays of the sun like a jewel set in the crown of the world, illuminating the paths that pilgrims from 3 great faiths still walked in search of meaning and blessing, warming the stones that had witnessed so much history and would witness so much more. It spread across the fields of Egypt, where the Nile continued its eternal journey from the highlands of Africa to the sea, bringing life to lands that had sustained civilization for millennia and would continue to do so for millennia to come. And as that golden light spread across the Middle East and beyond, touching lands and peoples who had never known the physical presence of the man whose memory it seemed to celebrate, it carried with it the promise that greatness was still possible for those who combined strength with mercy, ambition with humility, success with service to something greater than themselves. The legacy of Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, the Sultan at dawn, lived on in that promise, in the eternal hope that human beings could rise above their limitations to achieve something worthy of the divine spark that animated their brief lives on this ancient and beautiful earth. The sun climbed higher now, beginning another day in the long history of the world, while somewhere in the silence between the last notes of the call to prayer and the first sounds of the awakening city, the spirit of the great Sultan seemed to pause for one final moment on the threshold between time and eternity, between memory and hope, between the world he had known and the world that was yet to be born. In that moment of perfect stillness, all the struggles and triumphs of his extraordinary life seemed to resolve into something approaching peace, the peace that comes from knowing that one has played one's part in the great drama of human existence with honor and faith and love. And then the moment passed, as all moments must, but the light remained, spreading endlessly across the horizon, carrying with it the eternal promise of renewal and hope that had sustained his people through centuries of trial, and would sustain them through centuries yet to come. The Sultan at dawn had found his rest at last, but the dawn itself was eternal, painting each new day with colors of gold and promise, reminding all who witnessed its beauty that greatness was still possible for those who had the courage to pursue it and the wisdom to pursue it in service of something greater than themselves.